name is Anouar Majid. I'm the director of the center, and I am supported here by a number of colleagues in Lee and Dave in the back, Liz Bennett, and of course Jeff is always with us, as you know, and Josh Pahigian. He teaches actually these books to our students. So thank you all for doing such a great job. And thank you for all of you for coming, and for those old-time members who've been with us for years and years now. I really owe you a big debt of gratitude, because without you, this center would not be what it is today. So thank you. So Robert Zaretsky is a faculty member of the Honors College, University of Houston. He has written several books, most recently A Life Worth Living, Albert Camus and the Quest for Meaning, published by Harvard in 2013, and Boswell's Enlightenment, published also by Harvard in 2015. And he's now writing a book on the friendship between Catherine the Great of Russia and the French philosopher Denis Diderot. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, and I'm sure you have seen your name in all of these places, Times Literary Supplement, Foreign Policy, Times Higher Education, and Le Monde Diplomatique. He's also a contributing editor to the Los Angeles Review of Books and the Jewish Daily Forward. And I just want to also add that he gave an equally well-attended lecture in Tangier last fall, and so I'm glad to host him again in Portland, Maine tonight. So help me welcome him to the podium.
Can you hear me? Yes. This is not Tangier. Anwar promised me sandy beaches and warm weather, and no, I'm so pleased to be here. As I was in Tangier, pleased by the warmth and generosity of everybody associated with UNE, both in Tangier as well as here in Portland. And I'm no less bowled over by Portland. This is the first time I've been to your city, as I was by Tangier, which was my first time in that city. So I want to thank Anouar Majid, not just for the generosity that he's shown me over the last several months in bringing me to these two places, but also for his intellectual generosity, the sharing of ideas, the discussions of politics, of religion, of culture and society that we've had in Tangier, that will continue tonight over dinner, that we've had through countless email exchanges. And so, thank you, Anouar. Un grand merci.
Thank you. Yes.
And I need to thank Liz Bennett. She's a remarkable person, I mean, in so many ways, but never have my travels been handled so seamlessly and my visits handled so warmly as they have been by Liz, both in Tangier as well as here in Portland. So Liz, I can't thank you enough for all that you've done on my behalf. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on a, for me, extremely cold Monday night. And I'm a Northeasterner. I was born in the city, New York, right? And I grew up in New Jersey, and I went to university in Montreal. And so, but after 27 years in Houston, as my grandmother would say, my blood has thinned. And so, but I'm making do. Now, as you know, the topic of my talk tonight is moderation. When I mentioned to a friend back in Houston that I would be speaking on this topic at Portland tonight, he replied, "Speak neither too much nor too little." He's a funny guy. And I'll try. But this, of course, is the problem with moderation. We have different ideas, all of us, what too much is and what too little is. And as a consequence, we have a different idea of what the mean is between both one extreme and the other extreme. Now, I spoke about moderation in Tangier as well. It was less than a month after our election. And at the time, the subject of moderation seemed important. Tonight, it's a month or so after the inauguration, and the subject strikes me as being even more important. In Tangier, I spoke about the ancient Greeks just a little bit about Plato and Aristotle and their notions of moderation. But I spoke much more about somebody I know much more about, Albert Camus, and his notion of moderation. And what struck me then and now about Camus' notion of moderation is how relevant it is. He spoke about moderation in terms of rebellion. And rebellion for Camus was this position of what he calls pure tension. Tension between those who were driven by ideology and those who were given over to indifference. The rebel, the moderate, for Camus, inhabits the space between both one and the other. The rebel, unlike the revolutionary, privileges reality over abstraction, means over ends, and provisional aims over absolute aims. This is what Camus understood by la mesure, or moderation. Now, in a way, this is what the individuals I'll be talking about tonight also understood by measure, or moderation, namely James Boswell, David Hume, and Samuel Johnson. Now, James Boswell, who's the subject of my book, Boswell's Enlightenment, is best known today as Samuel Johnson's Boswell. In other words, he's known as the biographer of the great, or as Boswell called him, the stupendous Johnson. His life of Sam Johnson is thought by literary historians to be the first modern biography. But what interests me about James Boswell is not the life of Johnson he wrote. Instead, it's the life of James Boswell he wrote in his journals. Boswell strikes me as the first modern man. And this is a ridiculous claim. Think of this as clickbait. I just want to get your attention. But it's not just clickbait. There is, I think, an important element of truth to this. By the first modern, James Boswell embodied the same conflicts, the same confusions over who he was and what he was meant to be, over the claims of reason and the claims of faith. He embodies those conflicts and confusions, in other words, that we know today as well. Now, we tend to see the 18th century, known in your textbooks as the age of reason or the age of enlightenment, as this great contest, this epic battle between faith and reason, between faith and facts, between religion and reason. And it's a contest we've been taught in our high schools that reason wins, and wins with the speed and the finality of a slam dunk. It's no contest. But that's not the case. Instead, in the 18th century, a match between faith and reason begins that continues to this very day. It's a match that's been fought with great violence and no clear winner. And it's a match we're fighting today, not just with the two sides opposed to one another, but also our own selves, very often, that are opposed to one another. And this was very much the case for James Boswell. He was a divided self. But he wrote about this division with a lucidity, with a candor, and a compulsion. If you have ever seen the collection of his journals, you'll understand what I mean. That smacks of our own era. And no less important, he devoted much of his life as we devote our lives to trying on different selves. Who will I be today? And this is what historians have come to call self-fashioning. James Boswell was an expert at self-fashioning. Now, what I want to suggest is that central to self-fashioning, shaping yourself, was and is the exercise of moderation, both as a means as well as an end. James Boswell takes up a kind of therapy. And I hesitate to use that word, but I think it does apply. He sees his journals as a therapeutic aid in order to attain moderation, the Boswell that ought to be. And he takes this exercise up shortly after he leaves the university at Edinburgh, where he had been sent by his father. After he leaves Edinburgh and then a year spent in Glasgow, he leaves the universities without a diploma. He sort of hangs out for a while on the family estate in Auchinleck, and then he goes down to London and starts hanging out with this disreputable crowd of actors. His father didn't like it, and they eventually strike a deal, namely that Boswell can do what was known as the grand tour of the continent, if in exchange he first went to the University of Utrecht in Holland and did his law degree so that he could return to Scotland after his travels and take up the practice that his father would leave to him. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So he more or less did what, for example, is done here at the University of New England. He took a school year abroad. He also did this at the urging of his newly made friend in 1763, Samuel Johnson. Johnson urged him to go in order to see the sights. But the sights for Sam Johnson were not the ruins in Italy or the magnificent buildings and cathedrals in France. Instead, the sights for Samuel Johnson were the great minds in Europe. He wanted Boswell to go to the continent in order to interview them, in order to speak to them. And Boswell already had this desire. In fact, when he first started at the University of Edinburgh, with a friend, he climbed to the top of Arthur's Seat, overlooking the city. And from there, he stared east towards the continent, and he shouted, "Voltaire, Rousseau, immortal names." And so he pledged then to visit these men. And so in 1763, Samuel Johnson sees him off at the port of Harwich. And he gets on a packet boat for Holland, and he's clutching in his arms a book. It's the collected essays of Samuel Johnson, his Rambler essays. This book proves crucial to his education or to his self-fashioning, his effort to find moderation. Right before he left, he wrote in his journal, "Be like Johnson, never despair. Remember Johnson's precepts on experience of mankind. Consider, as Johnson tells me, there is truth." And this goes on and on and on. Once he found himself in Utrecht, Boswell lost it. He was alone in a dull and dreary city where he knew no one. And he quickly found himself on the verge of a nervous breakdown. as he wrote to a friend. In fact, he wrote more or less the same thing to many friends. I went out in the streets, and even in public, I could not refrain from groaning and weeping bitterly. So he falls into a depression for the first several weeks in Utrecht. And he finds his eventual cure in recalling, through constant repetition in his journals, recalling Samuel Johnson's person and his precepts. Be Johnson is a leitmotif in his journals. Think of Johnson and be again a man is yet another variation on this theme. At the same time, Boswell started reading Johnson's Rambler essays. Now, to give you an idea of what Boswell found in them, let's consider just for a moment essay number 32. In essay 32, Johnson reflects on the proper response we ought to have to human calamities, the inevitability of human calamities. Johnson dismisses the Stoics. Why? Because the Stoics, in turn, dismiss the reality of pain and suffering. They do not take it seriously. Johnson insists that we do take it seriously. Misery and pain are no less real, Johnson tells us, than the boulder that he kicked in Harwich with Boswell in order to prove that it existed. As Johnson writes in the essay, let us not expend strength on establishing opinions opposed to nature. Instead, we must assess our condition with lucidity and honesty. Only then will we recognize, and this is important, only then will we recognize that the cure for the greatest part of human miseries is not radical, it's palliative. In other words, there is no cure. There are just ways of managing our condition. And so for Johnson, as Boswell's reading him in his bedroom in Utrecht, Johnson is telling him we must find solace in reality, all the while applying strategies which, by their very nature, are partial and provisional, strategies to manage our state. And what these strategies boil down to is activity. As Samuel Johnson writes, the calamities of life, like the necessities of nature, are calls to labor and exercises of diligence. In many of his Rambler essays, not just number 32, and in fact in much of his writing, Johnson reflects on the traps that we set ourselves as a result of our desires and our passions, our fears and our frustrations. And it is not, he tells us, a pretty sight. As he writes, we desire, we pursue, we obtain, we are satiated. We desire something else and begin a new pursuit. And so must helpless man, to quote his famous line from The Vanity of Human Wishes, must helpless man in ignorance sedate, roll darkling down the torrent of his fate. Now, Johnson's reply to this question, the one that captivated Boswell, was no, or at least not entirely. Johnson insisted that we have the capacity to recognize and to moderate our predicament by confronting them. Now, for Johnson, reason plays a primordial role in this confrontation. We need reason. It alone, he writes, can keep constant guard over our imagination. It reminds us, he goes on to write, that a mean flexibility to every impulse and submission to the tyranny of everyday troubles is below the dignity of the mind. To maintain this dignity of the mind, he writes about the possibility of what he calls the management of the mind. Now, this management consists of the constant practice of reason, the constant practice of inner vigilance to make certain we do not confuse fantasies or fears for facts, that we never surrender reason to superstition or to enthusiasm, and that we always recall the limits of what we could or should expect from life and from others. In his Life of Johnson, Boswell described Samuel Johnson's essays as bark and steel for the mind. While he lived in Utrecht, he took daily doses of this bark and steel, and he set himself a thick and detailed schedule every day of what he was going to do. French lessons, flute lessons, the study of history, Tacitus, good for the soul, Voltaire, good for the mind, social visits, and keeping his journal. In fact, it was through his journal, I want to suggest, that he found a way of correcting or moderating his character. And he did this by writing a script, more or less. Every morning, he would write himself a memorandum. And in it, he would project all of the duties, the appointments, the tasks that he had given himself for that day. And then he would, as a director would, tell himself how he ought to be in each of these settings. At night, when he came back to his quarters, his chambers in Utrecht, he would review himself. He would critique or praise. Being Boswell, he often praised, but he was honest with himself, and he often critiqued his performance, which he saw as a performance. All with an eye on the ideal of being worthy of Samuel Johnson. In a way, this represents the secularization of Protestant self-examination, and this was very much in the very fibers of James Boswell, who was raised as a Calvinist and was haunted by that dreary education he received at the hands of his mother and his schooling. But there's a difference. With this kind of self-examination, the Calvinist God has been displaced, and in its place, you have a social ideal, or in James Boswell's case, you have an ideal embodied by Samuel Johnson. Now, we need to turn to David Hume, because this was going to be not too much and not too little. But let me leave you with one last arresting image that James Boswell offers of Samuel Johnson and why he thought Johnson worthy of being his ideal. In his Life of Johnson, he wrote, his mind, Johnson's mind, resembled the Colosseum at Rome. In the center stood his judgment, which, like a mighty gladiator, combated those apprehensions that, like wild beasts, were all around in their cells, ready to be let out again at him. After a conflict, he drove them back into their dens, but not killing them. They were still assailing him to his very death. In a word, the work of moderation is never done. It's never complete. And as Johnson warned his readers, it's never more than a palliative. Now let's turn to David Hume. James Boswell met David Hume long before he met Samuel Johnson. He met Hume when he was still at university, and Hume was living in Edinburgh. One day, Boswell simply knocked at David Hume's door, uninvited, unannounced. Hume answered, Boswell introduced himself, and he managed to slide into Hume's apartment, where they held a conversation for a good 30 minutes. Now, the reason Boswell called on Hume was simple. He was the great atheist. He was Scotland, perhaps Europe's most controversial thinker. He was a skeptic. He was a methodical skeptic whose work, beginning with his treatise of human nature, published in 1734, not only undermined received ideas about ourselves, about self-identity, but also received ideas about the nature of causality. It also undermined the underpinnings of a rational approach to religious belief. And in fact, it undermined the foundations of reason itself. Unlike Samuel Johnson, who insisted that reason must play a role in moderation, in moderating our lives, Hume thought it reasonable to think little of reason and reason's reach. He argued, beginning with the treatise, that reason has as much traction over our habits and predilections as prayers have over our futures. In his treatise of human nature, Hume clearly announces his position in one of his most famous and provocative phrases. He declared, "Reason is the slave to the passions." By that, he meant that reason is nothing more than the enabler and never the master of our passions, of those drives that are so deeply rooted in our natures and that determine the course of our lives. Reason has no traction on this. And Hume hammers at this point in various ways, in his philosophical treatises, in his popular essays, in his dialogues, even in his history of England. But while he insisted that reason had no control over our passions, all was not lost. He argued that there are two different kinds of passions, and he sets out this argument in his treatise. There are violent passions, passions like anger, envy, fear, frustration. But then, thank goodness, there are calm passions, charity, benevolence, friendship. And that these passions coexist. And he believed that if we cultivated our calm passions, they could influence the reach and the character of our violent passions. There will, he wrote, always be violent passions. What we must try to avoid is having violent passions exercised violently. In other words, anger will always be with us. Envy will always be with us. But what can the calm passions do in order to change their direction, pull them back in when necessary? Gesundheit. So, for example, he recognizes in his discussion of the love of gain, one of the violent passions, he recognizes that contrary passions like benevolence or charity don't stand a snowball's chance in Houston, right? It's simply the love of gain will always win in the end. But he goes on to suggest that we redirect that passion through the calm passions. For example, turning the love of gain towards philanthropy. That might work, he suggests. And his essays, which were as popular, if not more popular, than Samuel Johnson's essays were, his moral and political essays, which is really just philosophy by other means for Hume. He sees his essays as a means for his readers to regulate their passions. They're also therapeutic exercises, no less than Samuel Johnson's were, but therapeutic exercises which consider reason as simply not a player. We have to work with what we have, Hume argues. And reason, no, it's always going to be a minor league player. We have to work with our calm passions in order to overcome or control our violent passions. And so the aim of his essays as his work, as he wrote, was to promote moderation instead of zeal. And in his essays, he also quotes favorably Cicero, the Roman Stoic, who believed that philosophy is what Cicero called medicine of the mind. And so David Hume applied this same medicine to his patients, his readers. And he does this not with pills or with syringes. He does it through a narrative strategy in his essays and in his equally popular History of England, the 6-volume work. What he does in these various works is that he balances the two sides. For example, if you read his History of England, you discover, once you read the modern period, or at least his modern period, that it's almost formulaic. On the one hand, the Tories, on the other hand, the Whigs. On the one hand, the Tories, on the other hand, the Whigs. And he explained what he was doing, that he was trying to create a space so that his reader could measure what was right and what was wrong with each of the sides and bring them towards the center. Moderate these sides as a reader who, as a reader, I'm not being terribly moderate up here, as a reader who is moderating the work that he's reading, demanding that the reader be no less active than the characters in his historical narrative. And so he believed that the reader can be led to see opposing sides and what each of these sides had that was positive as well as negative, and that this in turn would help moderate their passions. Now, this was of crucial importance for Hume because passions sweep up not just individuals, they sweep up entire societies. And governments, for Hume, exist to restrain these passions, not exacerbate these passions. He writes, violent passion hinders men from seeing distinctly the interest they have in equitable behavior towards one another. Now, this is an obvious transition to our current state of politics. and society. It's too obvious a transition. I really don't want to take it. So let's not go there for the moment. We can go there during questions and answers or during the conversation we'll have after. Instead, I want to go there with a man, James Boswell, to whom this talk is more or less dedicated. Now, I wish I could report that in the contrasting therapies that both David Hume and Samuel Johnson offered James Boswell, that James Boswell found a cure, even a palliative cure, that he achieved moderation. But I'd be lying. He didn't. Both of these therapies failed Boswell. He couldn't follow through on either one. Well, he never really tried David Hume's, but Samuel Johnson's ultimately failed. James Boswell's life ended as immoderately. He was a womanizer. If you read his journals, you will lose count of the number of mercury treatments he had because of his dozens of sexual encounters. He was an alcoholic. He was a failed lawyer. He saw himself as a failed writer. And so he ended his life given to excess of drinking and despair, of fantasy and frenzy, as much of his earlier life. But this does not mean that moderation should not be our ideal. And it does not mean that, on occasion, it cannot be achieved. What I suggested last December in Tangier is that Albert Camus did achieve it, painful though it was. What I want to suggest here tonight is that Samuel Johnson achieved it. David Hume achieved it. And in fact, Hume achieved it in a way that more than 200 years after his death remains absolutely striking. And this is the note that I want to end on. On July 7th, 1776, James Boswell went to visit David Hume yet again in Edinburgh. Unlike the visit he had paid more than 15 years before, this visit was very different. David Hume was dying. He was dying of stomach cancer. And all of his enemies, and he had many, especially in the Calvinist clergy in Scotland, wanted to believe that as he lay dying, he would throw over his, and call it what you will, his atheism or his agnosticism, throw over his skepticism, and re-embrace the faith he had as a Calvinist as a child. And so the vultures were circling, waiting for that moment that Hume would recant. And among those vultures were Samuel Johnson and James Boswell. Samuel Johnson could not believe the reports that David Hume was facing his end with great equanimity and calm. And so he suggested to Boswell that he visit Hume to see what the truth of the situation was. And so Boswell does visit him. And the interview is absolutely extraordinary. I won't summarize it or read it out. It goes on for several pages towards the end of my book. But let me just read you the last lines. Following this interview, in which Hume tells Boswell with a smile that he's not going to recant, that he is very much at ease with his writings and with his beliefs, just as he is at ease with his death. after that, Boswell leaves Hume's apartment, and he drinks heavily. And the day that David Hume dies, Boswell goes to a street corner where there are prostitutes, finds one, makes love to her in the cemetery where Hume will be buried, heavily inebriated, okay? Because he is so disturbed by the way in which Hume had faced his end. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, let me read the last lines from the book, and I'll finish there, and then perhaps we can have a conversation about all of this, since it's already 6:45. Though he sought out and surrounded himself with men and women who were larger than life, Boswell is like us, but only more so. In his great swings of exuberance and enervation, his moments of great insight and great weakness, Boswell not only embodied the enduring doubts and hopes that mark the modern age, but also expressed them with an intellectual honesty and spare artistry, no less enduring. He wished that his journal be nothing more than the faithful register of the variations of my mind. And he succeeded beyond his wildest wishes. In his journal, Boswell registers our own variations of mind. I'll finish there and take questions. Thanks.
There are microphones on both sides, so please, if you have any questions, just seek the microphone.
First of all, I'm sure I'm going to ask an incredibly naive and very simplistic question.
I
But
always tell my students never to.
I say that too, but I don't really mean it, okay? No, no, seriously. I latched on to what you said at the beginning. We're talking about realism versus being realistic, and I'm not sure I'm using the right terms. One's equivalent to the means and one's equivalent to the ends. And so throughout your talk, I kept on going back to that. You know, one is the means and one's the ends. And you know, I think we get stuck with that in our society, where we have had, at least in our political system, some people recently, and not just the last month, but you know, the George W. Bush is a good example, where the ends justify the means. So no means. Okay. Without expletives before and after. No, I'm just kidding. And so I don't have a cogent question, other than you know, I love the idea of talking about the issues of being moderate, which makes sense and is very difficult for me to do these days, in order to try to have a rational dialogue. But then I feel like my ends are missing. You know, that might be a mean, but I don't feel like the ends can get there. And so I don't have a clear question for you. But I was wondering if you could explore a little bit more. Did I miss something when you're talking about means versus ends, or rebel versus revolution?
Well, this brings me back. Is this working? Yes. Okay, this brings me back to Camus, really, and not to Boswell. If you don't mind talking about Camus for a bit. In his philosophical essay, The Rebel, which was published in 1952, Albert Camus suggests, or he argues, that the rebel is unlike the revolutionary. And of course, you have to recall the context of 1952. The West is in the depths of the Cold War. France's largest political party in 1952 is the PCF, the Communist Party. There is a working class that still believes, not just in France, but in many other European nations, that the future will unfold according to a communist script. And this script is revolutionary. And he's one of the few voices in France at the time who is warning his nation that this script is radioactive. And he does this in part through the rebel. Revolutionaries always think and only think about ends. They are, to use the term of the German sociologist Max Weber, these are people who are animated by what Weber calls the ethics of conviction. They have ideals for which they will sacrifice not only their own lives, but the lives of just about everybody around them. The key thing, the only thing, is to realize that ideal. For example, a future which is classless and equitable. But if we have to wreak havoc, if we have to build gulags, if we have to starve millions of peasants in order to achieve it, so be it. So that's the ethics of conviction. On the other side, for Max Weber and for Albert Camus, is what Weber called the ethics of responsibility. This is where the means come in and not the end. Our responsibility is not towards an ideal. Our responsibility is towards each and every one of us in this room. And if somebody in this room must suffer in order to achieve an ideal, we're doing something terribly wrong. So those who are animated by the ethics of responsibility are not idealists. For example, when Camus first starts taking notes for the rebel, and this is during the Second World War, when France is occupied, in 1942, he finds himself living in southeastern France, taking a cure for his tuberculosis. And he's living in a village called Le Penedier, which is just outside a Protestant town or village called Chambon-sur-Lignon. Some of you might recognize this name. This was the Protestant village that saved thousands of Jewish children during the war. And the American philosopher Philip Halley wrote a book about this called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. Camus clearly knew what was taking place at Chambon. And in fact, you find elements of what he knew in his novel, The Plague, which was sort of, he would write in cycles, and his second cycle, the cycle of rebellion, okay? You have a novel, The Plague, and you have a philosophical essay, The Rebel. And so the rebel is somebody who doesn't seek this ideal, who always privileges the means, what involves us, over a particular end. So the rebel is somebody who lives this position of what he called pure tension. That we often think of the moderate as somebody who's wishy-washy, somebody who's feckless, somebody who doesn't really have a position. But as Camus argues in his work and argued in his life, it's just the contrary. To be a true moderate, to be a rebel, requires this relentless, unending exercise of energy to remain on the blade, on the edge of that blade, between falling off into revolutionary activity when you replace others with an ideal, or falling off into mediocrity, as he called it, when you simply when you surrender or you submit to the forces of history. And there is, and this might speak to your dissatisfaction. I'm sorry, your name? Amy. Amy? This might speak to your dissatisfaction about moderation. It's a tragic situation in the literal sense of the word tragic. It doesn't have a happy ending. This position cannot be maintained indefinitely. Sooner or later, the moderate will fail, will either give herself over to the forces of revolution or will allow herself to be subject to those very same forces. But for him, the fact that you would inevitably fail was of no never mind. He saw this, for example, in the case of French Algeria. He struggled and he struggled, though he knew there was no resolution. It was a tragedy in the sense that both sides were equally right. The more than 1 million Pieds Noirs, or French colonists who had lived there for several generations, and the indigenous peoples, the Arabs and the Berbers. In this struggle, something had to give. What's a moderate to do? Remind us that we're human, right? That's not an answer to your non-question.
I have a.
Sorry.
We have a question on the other side. Go right ahead,
Is this
sir.
on? Hi. I've always kind of thought like to an optimist or realist as a pessimist, and the other way around. So, for a moderate or someone with moderation, who's making that decision? Is it subjective or objective?
Yes.
Thank you. That's the right answer.
I mean, if you go back to Aristotle, he realizes the naughty nature of moderation, or of the mean. And so he talks about, first in abstract, what the mean means, that it's that middle position between two excesses or two extremes. Now that's clear enough, but then we come up with your question, right? And I'm sorry, your name? Jeff. So, I'm sorry? I work with Amy. Oh, okay. You don't have to. And so we can see that on a piece of paper, but our lives are not pieces of paper. They're not diagrams. And so then Aristotle, who's also a scientist, he's certainly not an empiricist, at least the way that we understand it, but he realizes the importance of life experiences. And so he goes on to suggest that when we decide what the mean is, it has to be through our own experiences, right? That there is no absolute mean, as Plato, for example, would have it. But the mean evolves. It changes according to the complexion of the landscape. It cannot stay the same. Now that, too, is not terribly satisfying. That was the best Aristotle can do. And I think that's the best we can do more than 2 millennia later. I think the most important thing to keep in mind about moderation is its embrace of a moderate form of skepticism. That it's always more important to ask questions than to offer answers. And once you have an answer to offer, that answer must and always will be provisional until a better answer, according to the changing landscape, comes about. For those of us who are looking for absolutes, who are looking for neat and tidy endings with, you know, if we're looking for comedies, it's not going to happen, according to Aristotle, according to Camus, and certainly not Samuel Johnson or David Hume or James Boswell, to try to bring things back to the 18th century.
Thank you. So I'm trying to identify in my head some of the assumptions that lead to your talk. And one is that these different figures can in some way communicate. That there is a notion of agreement or disagreement or bewilderment. They probably communicate in some intellectual plane, but it could be some other way. What happens when that's not possible? When they communicate, when each one communicates in such different ways that they never connect, that there is no notion of agreement or disagreement or convincing or even argument. are there still a consistent notion of what you were talking about?
Of moderation, you mean?
Yeah. And are my assumptions appropriate or correct?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Let me try to answer with a piece of history. James Boswell and David Hume agreed on very little. But they were both members of a club in Edinburgh called the Select Club. And this was a group of remarkable individuals: David Hume, Alan Ramsay, James Boswell, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, the list goes on. The pleiad of Enlightenment thinkers in what was known as the Athens of the North, Edinburgh, in the 18th century. They had many differences, philosophical and political. They also had religious differences. What they did in terms of religious differences is they agreed not to talk about religion in the Select Club. So they had a charter, and it was made explicit in the charter to the Select Club that religion will not be discussed. Okay, because we would reach that point that you worried about. When it came to politics, when it came to philosophical ideas, they often, to put it in a trite phrase, but it applies, they agreed to disagree. I think what they all understood was most important was maintaining this web of sociability, of conviviality. It was the age of conversation. Conversation is one of those calm passions that Hume makes a great deal of, as friendship is. He was a genius at friendship, David Hume, as was James Boswell, for that matter. And it was by emphasizing these elements that constitute the ethics of responsibility and sidelining those elements that constitute an ethics of conviction that made the Select Club such an extraordinary place. Now, the question is, and I can't help but hear present-day echoes in your concern, what happens when we face an opposing side with whom we don't share a language or with whom we don't share values? My response is, are we sure we don't share a language or we don't share values? Which I think is why today, more so than ever, moderation is so essential. It is so easy to write off those who voted for Donald Trump. I know I do that reflexively as well. But I live in a part of the world that you simply do not know here in Portland, Maine. We live in suburban Houston, and there were more Trump signs on lawns last November than there are azaleas now blooming in my neighborhood. They remain my neighbors. They're good people. We depend on them. They watch our children. We watch theirs. We watch football together. And we don't, just as the Select Club did not allow the discussion of religion, our informal clubs in Brookwood, where our neighborhood, we don't talk about politics. Not yet. We will talk about politics, though. The time is going to come because the scales are already falling from the eyes of many people who voted for Donald Trump. The people who voted for Trump in my neighborhood are engineers. They work at NASA. They aren't fools. To the contrary. They had their reasons. And with a bit more distance, we'll have these conversations over barbecue. But if I surrender my moderate position now, I can forget about those later conversations. It's not going to happen. And so that would be my answer of sorts.
Can I respond?
Yeah, here's the mic.
So let me go back 15 years or so. I'm in a room with a group of very conservative ministers. And wanting to strike up a conversation and always wanting to ask questions, I asked them what they do in their churches with difficult issues like homosexuality. And I thought we would have a discussion. And they responded very quickly and with a lot of confidence, it's not a hard issue. The Bible says it's wrong. And there was a collision. Mm-hmm. To me, there was a gradation of views. There were compromises. I expected a lot of intellectual agony. And I met people who came at it so differently that unless I wanted to be nasty, which I didn't, there was no continuing that conversation. And what would it have, I've had plenty of conversations with people who disagree with me, but we speak the same intellectual language of judgment and understanding. What would be the position of a moderate in the case I just mentioned?
Let me give you another historical. And this is not one from the 18th century. This is one from the 5th century before the Common Era. Let's think about Socrates, who I think of as a moderate. Who here has ever read a Platonic dialogue? Okay. Who here has read the Apology? Okay. You recall in the Apology, and in fact this is the case in many of the early and middle dialogues written by Plato, that as Socrates was engaging his interlocutors in this dialectic, when certain interlocutors were struck by what the Greeks called aporia, right? They suddenly realized with shock that what they believed to be true is not true. And so it's a kind of paralysis, like, are you trying to tell me that my entire life was built on paper mache? Right? And quite often, the response to aporia is anger. And so in the Apology, some of his interlocutors are angry at him. And what do? They walk away from him. Antius, for example, in the Apology, who is going to be one of the three who then brings charges against Socrates in 399, turns his back on Socrates. What does Socrates do? For those of you who have read the Apology, when Antius turns his back, he turns to the others who are still there and continues the conversation. And he continues the conversation as he's dying. And so these ministers, I guess in a way, turned their back. You just turn to somebody else who is willing to listen. I can't do better than that. I'm just a historian. I was not prepared to answer these existential questions.
This is changing directions a little bit, but you gave the path of pursuit, and then ending up with satiety. In America, I would add entitlement in that mix somewhere, because I think that has a lot to do with a lot of the grievances and anger in some factions now. So Is that something you want to talk about? Or not? Or maybe it's just another non-question like Amy.
No, I think you're right. I don't know what I can add to that, though. At least as a historian of modern France, I have no. I think entitlement is a huge issue right now. But this is really a conversation.
More so in this country, or do you think it's a global thing?
Oh, it's a thing in any country that has a society. I mean, it's not just a question of a plutocracy. Entitlements come in all shapes and sizes. And so I don't think it's unique to the United States or to France. I think that entitlement is something that the world has been dealing with ever since, as Rousseau tells us, we moved from our natural state into nascent society. And that's why he wished we never took that step, right? But it's a huge question, absolutely. And clearly it's a question that was, if not at the heart, lodged in one of the arteries of last year's election.
Clouds our sense of community and our sense of communal responsibility. The greater it gets.
It depends on how those who are entitled understand their entitlement. Well, yes, exactly, right? That there are, at least, perhaps this is the way we never were, but there was a time, say, in Great Britain where, for those of you who've watched Downton Abbey, right, that the landed gentry had duties and responsibilities towards those who did not have the same entitlements.
I'm talking about more the sense of entitlement, though, not just...
The sense of entitlement on the part of...
The sense of entitlement in terms of building resentment when you aren't able to get what you want.
Well, I would, again, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a sociologist. I know no more about the American scene right now than all of you. Probably most of you know much more about it than I do. But my sense, at least in my part of the country, is that this sense of entitlement is one that history gave the working class. That for years and years and years, their parents' generation, and then they too, were thought that things would just get better and better. But they have been facing, for decades, stagnant wages. Their jobs in rural Texas are disappearing, right? When I think about, the contrast between life in Houston and life in Pine Country in eastern Texas is as dramatic as the contrast between southern and northern Maine, I imagine. And, but I will not dismiss this sense of entitlement on the part of people from Lufkin or Nacogdoches in Texas.
I wasn't talking about just a class thing. I was talking about just anger in general, or even a plutocracy that feels entitled to be rich and do whatever they want with their money. So it's something that I feel is pervasive in America that sort of inserts into that trajectory.
But even
that you were
there,
talking
you
about.
can look for moderates who are
Sure.
resisting that. You think of the Bill Gates or the Warren Buffetts or the George Soroses. Yeah. They aren't entitled plutocrats. To the contrary.
I think we are running out of time.
Oh.
And, okay. So I'm going to use this occasion to ask the last question. And the last question would be, how does one form an intellectually, philosophically, morally responsible position, one of moderation, in an age where everything has been reduced, and you wrote about this recently, to entertainment and to the 24/7 news cycle?
That's a trap. I don't know yet. I don't have an answer to that. over the last 6 or 7 years, I stopped writing monographs, and I started writing books that people read. And I started writing for newspapers and magazines. I've been very lucky. But I find myself caught in this very same dilemma, that I think I have more lasting things to say in my books. I'm sorry, I'm being very presumptuous. I think the books, at least physically, will be with us much longer than a column in the New York Times. But I find that the only way in which I can reach readers now is through journalism. And this means that, in a way, this is what David Hume confronted. When his treatise of human nature was published, it was, as he says in his very short autobiography, it fell stillborn from the press. Nobody read it, and it wasn't reviewed anywhere. Okay? And David Hume, being David Hume, was disappointed for a few minutes and then bounced right back. Okay? And he decided, I'm going to do philosophy by other means. He turned to the equivalent of blogs in our own day. He started writing essays. And he saw himself as the ambassador, is the way he phrased it, the ambassador to the conversable world, the world where conversation is cultivated. And so he would present his philosophy in a more popular and accessible fashion in these essays that a public had been primed for with Addison and Steele and The Spectator and so on and so forth. And so maybe this is what we have to do by looking for readers where they are, not where they're not. They're not in the libraries any longer, I know that. For any faculty here, when was the last time you walked through the stacks of the library here at UNE? And if you have, did you bump into any students? Let me answer, no. Right? They don't go into stacks any longer. You have to find them in other places.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.